Chapter 3 Cosmic Beginnings. Here's a quote. There is nothing new under the sun, but there are lots of old things we don't know. Ambrose Bierce. So, that's technological resurrection. A fourth option for what we might experience after death. And it was a totally new idea when it occurred to me. But it wasn't a new idea to the world. Nope, not at all. People had thought of it before. And not just any people, famous philosophers and thinkers from our past. In fact, pretty much as soon as technological progress was a concept, technological resurrection was being considered by these heavyweight intellectuals. So why haven't we heard about this fourth option before? Why was this section ripped from the curriculum of life and hidden in the forbidden zone? And why is it reemerging now in certain very powerful and prominent circles? What's changed? To understand these things and to lend the entire concept of technological resurrection some badly needed credibility and history, we need to look back in time real quick to a group of philosophers not well known here in the West because they were Russian. The Cosmists. Cosmism. Once we start Googling things like technological resurrection, it doesn't take long until we're led down the rabbit hole to the philosophy now known as Cosmism. But let me warn you, once you find it, prepare to have your mind blown, because it turns out that Cosmism, a philosophy originally based on technological resurrection, fundamentally shaped the course of modern history. And if you're wondering how, I'll give you a little hint. Think cosmonaut. Now, at the time in which the original cosmists lived, the 1800s and early 1900s, they didn't call themselves cosmists. In fact, they didn't even think of themselves as belonging to a school of thought. But these guys communicated with one another and all shared common core beliefs. So, we lump them together now. Mainly, they felt mankind should use science to create a utopia on Earth, complete with immortality, and then colonize space to prevent overpopulation. And to create this utopia, society should focus on a few core goals, such as perfect health, immortality, and space travel. Basically, these guys were Trekkies before television even existed. But there's something important about these cosmists. You see, it's a well-accepted fact that all these futuristic ideas that would continue to permeate the intellectual circles of Russia for the next 100 years originated with just one guy. And in fact, if we were doing an investigation into cosmism and connected all of our clues on a wall with red lines, the guy at the center of the web would be Nikolai Fyodorov. Nikolai Fyodorov and Christian Cosmism. Now, Nikolai Fyodorov may have had a name like a Bond villain, but he's actually remembered for being an almost saintly scholar. Born in Russia in 1829, he was a humble and kind man whose only passions in life were books, studying Christianity, and philosophy. A real scholar's scholar. And like most bookworms, he kept mostly to himself, except for a few choice and intellectual friends. This will actually be important later. And as a man, he only ever became a librarian. But in his free time, he developed a theory about religion and science that is known today as Christian Cosmism. He blended and fused the two schools of thought together in a sci-fi take on Christianity that L. Ron Hubbard could only have ever dreamed of. So what were Fyodorov's ideas? Well, in his studies of the Bible, he came to a unique conclusion. He felt God had allowed Christ to be killed and resurrected, not to pay for our sins, but rather to provide an example to man that resurrection was possible. And the crucifixion was actually a sign that it was humanity's destiny to strive for and master the act of resurrection using science. So, God was kind of like, hey, this is what you're supposed to do. Be resurrected. Now you try. Using science. Go for it. a concept sometimes known today as technological resurrection. And once this idea of technological resurrection got into Fyodorov's mind, he fell in love with it. It became the central drive of his entire life. He became convinced that it was man's holy duty to not only master technological resurrection, but to use it on every person who had ever lived. You, me, him. He believed everyone should get a ticket back from Deathville. Fyodorov knew, of course, that the only way this would ever be possible was if mankind focused on science. And it was this belief that led him to devise ideas over the course of his life that today we would term cloning, three-dimensional molecular printing, geoengineering, space travel, genetic engineering, and even space colonization. And in my humble opinion, the fact that he was writing about these scientific ideas by candlelight in the 1800s can only be seen as a tremendous act of foresight, second to none. Ultimately, from all accounts, Nikolai began to see this, the technological resurrection of everyone who ever existed, as the great common task of mankind. He felt this common goal could unite people of all backgrounds, races, and creeds, and lead them to embrace science. Ultimately, guiding people to work together and march into a Star Trek-like utopia on Earth, which seems like a pretty good idea to me, to be perfectly honest. But sadly, Fyodorov never actually managed to inspire any kind of social movement, and he eventually died unknown, save for a handful of close friends. Having published nothing while alive, his private writings were actually collected and made public posthumously. And in the spirit of his Christian faith, they were made free of charge and with no copyright claim. His writings are known today as either the philosophy of the common task or the philosophy of physical resurrection. And you can find it in a split second on the internet. It's worth a read. So, how did his ideas turn into something called cosmism that we still read about today? And why is there a monument to the man in Russia? Well, remember those few friends he hung out with? They weren't like our friends. No. Nikolai Fyodorov's buddies were Leo Tolstoy, the guy who wrote War and Peace, Fyodor Dostoevsky, another great Russian writer whose books we are all definitely going to read one day, right? Vladimir Solovyov, a famous Russian philosopher, and a guy named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, among others. Wow. Now, it's obvious how being friends with ultra-famous writers and philosophers like Tolstoy and Solovyov would allow our thoughts and ideas to permeate culture, even long after we died. But it wasn't just Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, or Solovyov that made Nikolai Fyodorov so influential. No, it was actually that fourth guy he hung out with, Konstantin. You have probably never heard of him, but today he is known as one of the three fathers of rocketry, the father of theoretical and applied cosmonautics, and the father of spaceflight. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and secular cosmism. Born in Russia during 1857, Konstantin lost some of his hearing to scarlet fever as a child and had to be homeschooled. And it was only later, at the age of 16, that he got any formal education. This happened when he went to a library where one Nikolai Fyodorov happened to be working. There, Fyodorov became Konstantin's mentor and filled his young mind with dreams of humans one day using science to achieve immortality and colonize space. And out of all of Fyodorov's ideas, young Konstantin fell in love with the dream of space travel the most. It became his passion in life. He would often later openly credit Fyodorov and the works of Jules Verne for inspiring his fascination with space travel and all that he achieved in life. So, what exactly did this guy achieve? A lot, as it turns out. Over the course of his life, he developed many of the equations and ideas that eventually led to our very real age of rocket-propelled spaceships. He wrote works on rocket propulsion, self-contained biomes, and airlocks long before almost anyone else had even dreamed of going to the moon. He was the first to build a wind tunnel, the first person to conceive of the idea of a space elevator, an idea that would later become a favorite of the great science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke. And his most important work, published in 1903, was Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices. Quite frankly, Konstantin was a prolific inventor, scientist, and writer. And it would take me 10 pages to list all of his inventions, books, ideas, and accolades. So I suggest you take a few minutes to read his short biography on Wikipedia, or you will never understand the full weight of this man's impact on history and why he is so revered. He was like Nikola Tesla, Jules Verne, and the Wright brothers rolled up into one. But although he was made a member of the Socialist Academy in 1918, he received little notoriety outside of intellectual circles until much later in life, which finally happened when scientists started spreading his works and ideas because they were beginning to actually use them to build things, like spaceships. Now, while Constantine is considered to have been a follower, disciple of Nikolai Fyodorov, he was his own man, and like so many others, he found the root origin of Fyodorov's ideas, technological resurrection, to be a noble idea, but ultimately beyond the pale of reason. And so instead of embracing Fyodorov's Christian cosmology, Constantine embraced the idea of panpsychism, the idea that all matter is somewhat conscious and that it is the form and complexity of matter that makes it more or less conscious. A secular idea. He even wrote about it at length in one of his many books, The Will of the Universe. Now, despite all of these achievements, like Fyodorov and so many other great minds, Constantine died mostly unknown to the world. But later, as the Soviet Union and the United States entered the space race of the 1960s, most of the Soviet scientists sending cosmonauts into outer space credited Constantine's work as forming the basis and inspiration for their own. He had become a hero to them, an almost mythological figure. And this is how the dreams of a poor, humble librarian with the soul of a saint were carried through the generations to become our reality. Putting cosmism in perspective. So, how many times have we all watched footage of a space shuttle launch, or watched footage of cosmonauts orbiting Earth, or astronauts playing golf on the moon, and felt that sense of awe and wonder? Personally, I've watched footage of all of this dozens of times, and once I learned of cosmism, I found it strange to suddenly watch that majestic footage of those giant rockets launching into space, now knowing that the first men who dreamed and designed them wanted to go to space to colonize planets because they were going to resurrect everyone who ever lived on Earth. And well, we needed the space. Isn't that wild? Now, if Nikolai Fyodorov had never existed, would Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's would he have gone on to advance rocket science and space travel the way he did? Would so many Russian philosophers have been pushed to discuss space travel and scientific utopias? If Tsiolkovsky hadn't pushed rocket science and Russian thought to space travel, would the Russians still have started the space race when they did? These are interesting questions, and the answer probably isn't black and white. These ideas would have probably still been discussed. The sciences would have still advanced. Jules Verne, Tesla, Goddard, and many others were working on similar ideas even without the influence of Fyodorov. But it probably wouldn't have all gone down the same. The space race might have never happened, or come later. Who knows? We might still only be sending rockets into low orbit. As easy as it is to dismiss the impact of a single great mind here or there in history, it's remarkable that since the space race ended, no nation has gone back to the moon. Space exploration has almost ceased, and only now, with powerful individuals like Elon Musk pushing for it, are we talking about it once again. So it's safe to say that we can give credit where credit is due. Nikolai Fyodorov and his vision of the common task of technological resurrection pushed history in the right direction. There was a definite butterfly effect there, and that's why he is a historical figure. Alright, so I'm going to finish this chapter in part 2 next video.